The mornings always began the same way for Elena. Before the rooster crowed, before the horizon even hinted at light, she was already awake, lying stiff on her narrow straw cot, bracing herself for what the day would bring. The walls of the cabin she slept in were thin, letting through every groan of wind and every drunken snore from the man who ruled her life with fists and boots. His name was Garrison Hodge, a settler who had carved his claim into the desert earth not with sweat and patience, but with cruelty. Elena had come to him not by choice, but by misfortune. Her parents had perished on the trail westward fever had swept through their wagon train, leaving her, a girl of 16, suddenly untethered. Garrison had offered her shelter, a word he wielded like bait on a hook. Shelter, yes, but at the price of her freedom. Within weeks, the kindness had curdled, and she had become less a ward than a servant, less a servant than a thing. Each dawn, she endured the same ritual. Garrison's wife, a bitter woman with eyes sharp as barbed wire, would rouse her with a bucket of cold water if she lingered too long in sleep. Then came the orders: stoke the fire, fetch water, feed the livestock, prepare breakfast. Any hesitation brought blows, sometimes from the wife's hand, sometimes from Garrison's belt. The bruises on her arms and ribs were like a second skin, now purple, green, fading to yellow, only to be covered by fresh marks the next day. The other settlers in the nearby homestead knew. They heard the shouts through the thin desert air, saw the way Elena flinched when spoken to. Yet no one interfered. To them, she was Garrison's problem, his property. A girl without kin, without dowry, without standing in the world was worth less than the mules tied to the post. Despite the pain, Elena clung to something deep inside her, an ember that refused to go out. At night, when her bruises throbbed and her body begged for rest, she would press her hand against the window and gaze at the stars. The desert sky was vast and endless, and she whispered to herself that freedom must exist somewhere beneath those constellations. But each morning, that hope was buried under the weight of survival. On this particular morning, the air was bitter cold, and the wind rattled the cabin walls. Elena rose quietly, careful not to wake the household too soon. Her body ached from the previous night's beating. She had dropped a bucket of water on the dirt floor, spilling it before Garrison's boots. The memory of his hand striking her across the face burned hot, even now. She crept to the hearth, coaxing the fire back to life. Sparks leapt up, warm against her pale skin. As the flames grew, she allowed herself a stolen moment of peace. Fire, at least, did not strike her. Fire only consumed what it was fed, and in its steady glow she felt a strange kinship. The reprieve was short-lived. The bedroom door banged open, and Garrison appeared, his eyes still clouded with sleep, his breath sour with whiskey. "You're slow again," he barked, and before she could answer, he cuffed her shoulder. The blow sent her staggering, her hip striking the corner of the table. Pain shot up her side, but she bit her tongue, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a cry. "Get the slop ready for the pigs," he ordered. "And don't think of dawdling, girl. You eat after the animals." Elena bowed her head, not daring to meet his gaze. She knew that looking him in the eye was an invitation to rage. Quietly, she gathered the scraps and carried them outside, the cold air biting into her lungs. As she scattered the food into the trough, she let her eyes drift beyond the corral, toward the desert stretching endlessly into the horizon. The mountains in the distance were painted faint silver by the rising dawn. Something stirred inside her chest, an ache that was more than hunger, more than pain. It was longing. Every day was a cycle of cruelty. Every night a cage of silence. But that morning, for reasons she could not explain, Elena felt the ember inside her flare brighter. Perhaps it was the way the sun crested over the mountains, turning the desert gold. Perhaps it was the way the wind seemed to whisper of places far beyond Garrison's reach. Or perhaps it was simply that her spirit, though battered, refused to die. She clenched her fists and whispered under her breath, "One day." It was the only promise she could give herself. One day she would be more than a beaten girl. One day she would find the freedom that waited beyond the horizon dot, and though she did not yet know it, that day was closer than she dared to imagine. The land itself seemed to conspire in Elena's misery. Dry winds scoured the earth until it cracked. Dust settled in every fold of clothing, in every crevice of the cabin, in her lungs when she lay awake at night. The frontier was not a place of abundance, but of hunger and suspicion, and every settler clung to what little they had, with desperation. For men like Garrison Hodge, cruelty was a currency he spent freely on his animals, his neighbors, his wife, and most of all on Elena. Rumors of Apache raids drifted through the settlement like smoke, thick with fear. Wagons had been found burned. On the trail, livestock driven off, men cut down with arrows still lodged in their flesh. The settlers spoke of it at night, their voices tight with dread, their rifles always within reach. To them, the Apache were savages relentless and merciless. Garrison himself spat the word redskin often, using it to fuel his own authority as if his beatings of Elena were part of a broader war. But Elena did not see war. She saw only chains. The talk of raids was little more than a distraction from her daily reality. Whatever danger lay beyond the settlement, it could hardly be worse than what she endured within it. If the Apache came, at least it might be a change or rupture in the cycle of blows and commands. Her body bore the evidence of this cycle. Bruises on her arms, welts across her back, scars from burns where she had stumbled near the hearth under the weight of a heavy pot. The women in the neighboring cabins noticed but said nothing. Some pitied her. Others were relieved it was her and not them. A girl without kin, without dowry, without the protection of a man, had no voice here. Work was endless. Dawn brought the chores, feeding pigs, hauling buckets of water from the well, grinding corn for bread. The fields demanded tending even when the earth cracked beneath the sun. Her muscles ached constantly, her hands blistered and calloused. Yet she was given less food than the hogs. Garrison's wife rationed her scraps with malice, snaring that a thin back bent faster to labor in the evenings. When the men gathered to drink, Elena often became the object of mockery. Garrison's stray, they called her, laughing at. The bruises they pretended not to see. She kept her eyes on the floor, silent, because silence was safer than speaking. But inside, the silence grew heavy, pressing down until it became nearly unbearable. At night, when she lay awake on her straw cot, the sounds of the plains reached her through the thin cabin walls, the howl of coyotes, the low rustle of wind over the grasses, sometimes even the distant echo of drums. She had heard the settlers mutter that the Apache held ceremonies deep in the canyons, their fires visible on clear nights. To the settlers, this was a threat. To Elena, it was a reminder that life outside this cage existed. There were people out there who had not been broken into silence, who had not surrendered themselves to cruelty disguised as order. And yet, she feared as much as she hoped. Stories of captives taken by the Apache made their way through the settlement, women dragged away, never seen again, or worse, returned only to tell of unspeakable horrors. Garrison repeated such tales often, a gleam in his eye as he warned her, "You'd better pray to stay under my roof, girl. Out there, you'd beg to come crawling back." But even as he said it, Elena wondered, could the wild, even with its dangers, truly be worse than this? She asked herself the same question. Every day as she worked under the sun, her skin raw and burned. She asked it every night as she pressed a bruised cheek against the hard pillow, Something had begun to stir inside her, a quiet rebellion, fragile but persistent. She found herself stealing glances at the horizon more often, measuring the distance to the mountains, imagining the cover of night as a shield. The settler's terror of the Apache did not blind her to her own truth. Whatever waited beyond these fields, it might also be her only chance. The plains held both fear and possibility, shadow and escape. Elena knew only this: if she stayed, she would not survive much longer. And somewhere out there, in the vastness she could barely imagine, the course of her life was already shifting. The beating that drove Elena into the desert began like so many others, sudden, senseless, and fueled by whiskey. It was late afternoon, the sky seared red with the heat of a long day. Elena had returned from the well with her shoulders aching from the yoke and buckets. A thin stream of water had sloshed over her skirt, dampening the hem. Garrison saw it before she could set the buckets down. "You clumsy bitch," he snarled, his voice already thick with drink. The slap came fast, splitting her lip. When she stumbled, he struck her again, harder this time, his fist thudding against her cheekbone. The bucket tipped, spilling its contents across the packed dirt floor. That was enough to unleash his rage. He beat her with the back of his hand, with the belt hanging from his trousers, until her vision blurred and her knees buckled. The others, his wife, his sons, watched in silence. This was nothing new. When he finally turned his back, muttering about wasted water, Elena staggered to her feet. The air in her lungs burned, her ribs throbbed, but something inside her had shifted. She could not take another day of this. If she stayed, she would die, whether by his hand or by despair. It no longer mattered. Her legs moved before her mind. Caught up, she stumbled out the door, across the yard, past the pig pen. Garrison's voice roared behind her, but she didn't stop. She climbed the fence and ran, her bare feet kicking up dust, her torn dress catching on mesquite branches. The desert stretched before her, merciless and wide. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the scrubland. She had no food, no water, and no plan, only the desperate urge to put distance between herself and Garrison. She ran until her lungs gave out, until her body collapsed in the dry grass. For a long while she lay there, gasping, blood from her split lip drying against her chin. Coyotes yipped in the distance. The horizon darkened. Fear crept in now, whispering of thirst, of wild animals, of what would happen if Garrison found her. She tried to rise, but her strength failed. The ground beneath her blurred as exhaustion pulled her under. That was when she sensed it: movement, soft and deliberate, a presence that did not belong to the wind. Her eyes flickered open. A man stood a few paces away, half shadowed by the dying light. He was lean, his face stern but not cruel, his skin weathered by the same sun that had burned her. His hair was black, bound with leather, his chest bare beneath a fringed buckskin vest. Across his shoulder rested a bow. For a moment, Elena thought she had conjured him from the stories whispered in the settlement. An Apache scout, silent and watchful, the kind the settlers feared. Her breath caught. Panic surged, but her body was too weak to run. She pressed her palms into the dirt as if she could melt into it. The man did not raise his weapon. He studied her with eyes that were dark and unreadable, taking in her torn dress, her swollen face, the bruises that painted her arms. His gaze lingered, not with hunger, but with something closer to recognition. Elena tried to speak, but only. A rasp came out. She braced herself for whatever would come: capture, death, or worse. Instead, the man crouched down, moving slowly, as one would approach a wounded animal. He touched the ground near her hand, then pointed to his chest. "Dakota," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. The word was strange to her ears, but she understood enough. His name, her own name, stumbled from her lips. Elena. For a long while, they simply stared at each other. She could hear her own heartbeat, frantic and uneven, as if it would burst from her chest. The silence stretched until at last he reached into a pouch at his side and drew out a small leather flask. Without ceremony, he offered it to her. Elena hesitated, then lifted it to her lips. The water inside was cool, sweeter than anything she had ever tasted. It slid down her throat, reviving her in a way she hadn't thought possible. When she lowered the flask, her hand shook. The man Dakota watched her, his expression still unreadable. Yet, in that moment, she felt something shift. He had not struck her, had not mocked her, had not turned away. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen not property, not a burden, but a person. And though she could not know it yet, this meeting born of violence and chance would alter both their lives forever. Elena woke with the chill of desert night pressing against her bones. The stars stretched wide above her, sharp and cold, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the stiffness in her ribs reminded her, and the shadowed figure sitting a few yards away brought it back in full. Dakota had not left. He sat cross-legged near a small fire, feeding it with thin sticks, his bow always within reach. The flames lit the planes of his face, showing the lines of a man who had seen more grief than rest. When Elena stirred, his head turned, but he made no move toward her. Instead, he gestured with 2 fingers toward the fire, inviting her closer. She hesitated, then dragged herself to the warmth. Her skin prickled as the heat touched her. For a long while, neither spoke. She could not find words in his tongue, and he did not know hers. But silence was safer than questions, and they shared it as if it were a fragile thread. By morning, Elena's resolve to stay hidden was tested. The sound of distant shouting carried across the plains Garrison's voice, harsh and furious. He had rallied 2 of his neighbors to track her down. Dogs barked in the distance, baying at her scent. Her heart pounded. "They're coming," she whispered, though she knew Dakota could not understand. Her hands trembled, clutching at her skirt. Panic threatened to undo her. Dakota had already risen. He pulled his knife free from its sheath, then crouched beside her. He touched his chest, then hers, and shook his head. The message was clear enough. They will not take you. Minutes later, the man appeared over a rise Garrison in front, his face red and swollen with rage, a rifle slung across his back. The 2 settlers with him bore lanterns and pistols, their eyes scanning the brush. The dogs strained against their leashes, noses to the ground. When they spotted Elena by the fire, Garrison let out a roar. "There you are, you filthy wretch. Thought you could run from me?" Elena flinched, but Dakota stepped between them. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, bow drawn with an arrow aimed low but ready. The firelight caught on the sharp stone tip. The settlers froze. "Apache," one of them muttered, his voice tight with fear. Garrison sneered, but his bluster faltered. "That's mine you've got there," he said, pointing past Dakota at Elena. "My girl. Hand her over, savage, before I put an end to you." Dakota did not move. He shifted the arrow higher, the string drawn taut. His eyes locked on Garrison's with a calm that was more dangerous than any rage. Elena could not breathe. She watched as Garrison's face twisted. He wanted to fight, but he was no fool. The stories he himself had spread about Apache skill with the bow now betrayed him. Even drunk on anger, he knew one wrong step would see an arrow buried in his chest. The standoff stretched thin until at last Dakota broke it. He placed his hand firmly over his own chest and spoke one word in his tongue, clear and resonant. "Mine." The settlers stiffened, but the meaning was plain. Garrison's face purpled with fury. "She ain't yours. She belongs to me." He took one step forward, then stopped as the arrow angled toward his throat. The dogs whimpered, sensing their master's hesitation. Elena's heart thudded in her ears. No one had ever claimed her, except as property, a tool to be beaten and used. But this was different. Dakota's claim was not possession, it was protection. The difference was so sharp it made her eyes sting. Finally, one of the neighbors muttered, "Let it go, Garrison. Ain't worth it. You push him, we're all dead men." Garrison spat into the dirt, his hands shaking. His pride would not let him back down gracefully, so he turned his fury on her. "You'll regret this, girl. You'll wish I'd taken you back when I had the chance." He jerked the dog's leashes, signaling retreat. The three men backed away, their curses carrying on the wind, until they disappeared into the dark. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Elena sank to her knees, trembling with relief and terror both. Dakota lowered his bow but did not relax. He watched the horizon long after they were gone, ensuring no ambush followed. Only when he was certain did he glance back at her. She met his eyes and whispered, voice hoarse but steady, "Thank you." He did not answer in words, only gave a small nod. But in that moment, Elena knew something had shifted forever. For the first time in her life, someone had stood between her and the fists that sought to break her. Someone had looked at her not as a burden, but as a life worth shielding. And though she did not yet understand the full weight of it, Dakota's claim had just bound her fate to his. The days that followed were quieter, though not without tension. Elena remained close to Dakota, partly from fear of the land and partly from the knowledge that Garrison's rage still lingered beyond the horizon. Yet her unease ran deeper than that. She had never been free, not truly, and the absence of a master's command left her unsteady, as though she were walking on new legs. Dakota spoke little. His grief hung around him like a shadow. At night, when Elena pretended to sleep, she sometimes heard him murmur words in his own tongue, his voice soft but filled with sorrow. She did not understand, but she felt the weight of it. A man who had lost someone, perhaps a wife, perhaps more, was no stranger to pain. During the day he showed her small things. How to move quietly over the desert floor, how to find water. Hidden in the roots of mesquite, how to read the flight of birds to guess where animals might be. His lessons were simple, sometimes wordless, but patient. Elena struggled at first. Her hands were clumsy, her strength waning from years of underfeeding. Once, when she failed to draw the bowstring more than a hand's length, frustration burned her cheeks. She had been told all her life she was weak, and the truth of it threatened to overwhelm her. But Dakota did not strike her for failing, nor mock her. Instead, he placed his own hand over hers, steadying the bow. With gentle pressure, he guided her grip, showing her the balance. His touch was firm, practical, without cruelty. For Elena, it was a revelation. Each evening they shared the fire, a fragile peace growing between them. She began to understand fragments of his words: water, food, walk, rest. Sometimes he tried her words too, repeating them slowly, shaping his mouth around the foreign sounds. When she laughed at his stubborn mispronunciations, his stern face softened for the first time, the corner of his mouth almost curving into something like a smile. Still, mistrust lingered. Elena could not forget the stories settlers told of captivity women. Taken, used, discarded. She watched Dakota closely for any sign of such intent, yet he gave none. He kept his distance, his respect, even when she was vulnerable. His restraint unsettled her as much as it comforted her, because it forced her to confront a possibility she had long abandoned, that not all men sought to break what they touched out at night. She dreamed of Garrison. In her dreams, his fists came down, his voice thundered. Sometimes she woke gasping, clutching at her bruised ribs. Dakota never asked, never pressed her. But once she opened her eyes to find him sitting nearer than usual, his bow across his lap, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. Watching, guarding, the desert itself became part of their bond. Where Elena once saw only barren danger, she now began to notice its quiet order. The call of quail at dawn, the rustle of lizards in the brush, the way the stars burned sharper than any candle flame. It was harsh, yes, but it was honest. Unlike Garrison's cabin, there were no false walls here, no blows hidden behind kindness. One evening, as the fire cracked low, Helena gathered the courage to speak. Her voice trembled in the silence. "Why me?" Dakota tilted his head, not understanding. She pressed a hand to her chest. "Why take me?" He studied her for a long time. Then he tapped his own chest and said, "Widow." His voice was flat, but the word hung heavy. After a pause, he pointed at her, then made a cutting gesture across his arm, mimicking the lash of a whip. His eyes narrowed, his jaw hard. Elena understood. He had seen her suffering, recognized it as something no one should bear. His claim had not been of ownership, but of defiance. To leave her behind would have been to condone what had been done. To her, for the first time since her parents' death, Elena felt seen. Not pitied, not scorned, but understood. She lowered her eyes, whispering, "Thank you." The words were too small for the weight she felt, but they were all she had. Dakota gave no reply. He only added another stick to the fire, the flames rising between them. But in the flicker of light, Elena thought she saw the faintest softening in his face, as though the ember of his grief had shifted, if only slightly. In the silence of that desert night, two wounded souls, one beaten, one bereaved, began to mend, not with sudden passion or spoken vows, but with the quiet persistence of survival shared. Word spread quickly across the settlement that Garrison Hodge had been humiliated by an Apache. Few details were clear, just that he had gone out with dogs and neighbors to drag back his runaway girl and returned empty-handed. His face twisted with fury, his pride shattered. He told the story often, each retelling sharper than the last. The Apache had stolen her. The Apache had threatened his life. The Apache had dared to claim what was his. Around the fire, in the tavern, at the church steps, Garrison spat the tale like venom. And with each telling, the settlers' fear swelled. Fear was the true currency on the frontier. It kept rifles loaded, children indoors after sundown, and neighbors close-knit against a common enemy. The Apache were already whispered of as shadows that slipped through the night, stealing horses, burning wagons, leaving only ash behind. Now Garrison gave those whispers a shape, a face, a grievance. First, "They take a girl," he growled, slamming his fist against the table at the tavern. "Next, they'll come for your wives, your children. You think they'll stop with me?" Some muttered agreement, others looked away. The men knew Garrison was a brute. His beatings of Elena had not been secret, but few cared to intervene. Before. Now, with his pride at stake, he dressed his cruelty as righteousness. By the second week, he had gathered half a dozen men willing to ride with him. Not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Better to strike first, they reasoned, than wait for the Apache to strike again. The women whispered about it too, though more cautiously. A few admitted they had seen the girl's bruises, that maybe she was better off gone. But their voices carried no weight, and their husbands' silence drowned them out. At night, Garrison sharpened his knife by lantern light, the steel flashing against his scarred knuckles. His wife sat silently nearby, her lips pressed thin. She had never defended Elena, never raised a hand to protect her, but neither had she expected her husband's obsession to grow so consuming. He spoke less of crops or weather now, and only of revenge. "We'll ride at dawn," he told the men one evening, his voice hard as stone. "I'll show that Apache what happens when you cross a white man. I'll take back what's mine, and I'll hang his scalp above my door for all to see." The men grunted. uneasy but bound by their fear, not far from the settlement. Elena and Dakota felt the weight of this wrath without hearing its words. Dakota was not blind to the risk. He knew settlers did not forgive humiliation, and men like Garrison carried grudges sharper than any blade. Each day he scouted farther, circling back to where Elena hid among the rocks and mesquite. He returned with little more than small game, sometimes with nothing at all, but always with a watchful gaze. Elena, though she tried to match his silence, could not still the dread that grew inside her. She knew Garrison's temper, knew how far he would go to make a lesson of her. The thought of him coming for her again made her stomach twist. Yet there was nowhere else to go. She asked Dakota one night, her voice quiet, "Will they come?" He did not answer at once. He only looked into the fire, his jaw tight. Then he nodded once. Her heart sank, though she had expected nothing less. "What will we do?" She pressed, her words trembling. Dakota met her gaze. He tapped the bow at his side, then touched the earth with his palm. His meaning was clear. "We will stand." Here Elena drew in a breath, steadying herself. She had fled beatings, endured hunger, carried fear for so long it had nearly swallowed her whole. Now for the first time she faced a choice: to run again, or to stay and fight for the life she had begun to glimpse. The decision would not be hers alone. Garrison was coming, and he would bring the weight of the settlers' wrath with him. Desert was quiet that night, but beneath the silence, war was stirring. The settlers came at dawn. Elena knew it before she saw them. She woke to the nervous shifting of Dakota's horse, to the distant thunder of hooves carrying across the plains. The air itself seemed to tighten, heavy with dust and intent. Dakota was already moving, bow in hand, his body taut with readiness. He did not speak. He only motioned for Elena to stay low behind a cluster of rocks. His eyes told her what words could not: stay alive. The riders appeared over the ridge, 7 in all. Garrison led them, his broad frame hunched forward in the saddle, rifle gleaming in the rising sun. The men fanned out, forming a half circle. Their shouts cut the silence, taunts, curses, the rattle of spurs. "Come out, savage!" Garrison bellowed. "Bring me the girl, and I might let you live." Elena crouched behind the rocks, her heart hammering. She wanted to shrink into the earth, to disappear, but Dakota's presence steadied her. He stood in the open, silent, his bow raised. He looked like part of the land itself, unyielding, unmoved. The first shot cracked the air. A settler fired too soon, the bullet kicking up dust near Dakota's feet. In the same breath, Dakota loosed his arrow. It struck the shooter in the shoulder, knocking him from his horse with a cry. The fight erupted. Gunfire roared, echoing off the rocks. Horses screamed, hooves tearing up the ground. Dakota moved with deadly precision, loosing arrow after arrow, each one finding its mark. He wasted no movement, his body flowing like water, his face carved from stone, but he was only one man. The settlers pressed hard, their rifles spitting lead, forcing him back. Elena clutched a jagged rock in her hands, her breath ragged. She wanted to run, to flee into the desert, but her body refused. She could not leave him. Garrison dismounted, his boots striking the ground with a thud. His eyes burned with rage as he advanced, rifle raised. "You think you can take what's mine?" He snarled. "I'll kill you, and I'll drag her back." In chains. Dakota drew another arrow, but before he could release, Garrison fired. The shot tore past Dakota's arm, grazing him. He staggered, his bowstring snapping under the strain. Blood darkened his sleeve. Elena's body moved before. Her mind could catch up. She scrambled from behind the rocks, shouting, "No!" Her voice cracked the chaos for an instant. Garrison froze, stunned to see her rise against him. His sneer twisted into something crueler. "So this is how it is," he spat. You stand with him now, after all I gave you? Elena's throat
burned with words she had never dared to speak.
You gave me nothing, she shouted. You beat me. You broke me. And I will never go back. For a heartbeat, silence fell. Even the settlers wavered, unsettled by her defiance. Dakota seized the moment. He lunged forward, knife in hand, closing the distance between them. The two men clashed, steel against steel, fury against resolve. Garrison swung his rifle like a club, striking hard, but Dakota absorbed the blows with grim endurance. His knife flashed once, twice, carving shallow cuts. Elena's rock still weighed in her hand. As Garrison raised the rifle for a killing strike, she surged forward, slamming the stone into his temple with all the strength left in her battered body. The crack was sickening. Garrison staggered, blood running down his face. Dakota did not hesitate. With one final thrust, his blade drove deep. Garrison collapsed, the earth swallowing his rage. The remaining settlers faltered. Their leader was gone, their courage with him. One shouted to retreat, and they hauled their wounded comrade onto a horse before fleeing, dust trailing behind them like smoke. Then it was quiet again. Elena dropped the stone, her hands trembling, her breath ragged. Dakota stood over Garrison's body, chest heaving, blood soaking his arm. His eyes flicked to her not with reproach, but with something fierce, almost reverent. She had chosen. She had stood. The fire of battle still burned in her veins, but beneath it was something steadier, the knowledge that she had broken free. Not because someone had saved her, but because she had saved herself. Dakota bent, pulling his knife free, then lifted his gaze to the horizon. The fight was over, but the war between settlers and Apache was not. He knew more men would come, but for that moment, in the silence of the desert, Elena and Dakota stood side by side, no longer captive and protector, but allies bound by blood and choice. The desert was quiet after the fight, unnaturally so. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the dry air, mingling with blood and dust. Garrison's body lay still where it had fallen, a dark stain spreading beneath him. His men had fled, but Elena knew the reprieve would not last. Settlers did not forgive. They would come back angrier, louder, more numerous. Dakota said nothing as he bound the wound on his arm with a strip of cloth torn from his shirt. His movements were steady, practiced, though his face was pale with loss of blood. When Elena tried to help, he shook his head gently, as if to tell her he was not broken. She sank onto the ground beside the fire pit, her hands still streaked with dirt and Garrison's blood. Her body trembled, though from what fear, exhaustion, or something else, she could not say she had struck the blow herself. She had ended him. For years she had been little more than a shadow under his fists, a girl who endured. Now she had acted, and in that act she had crossed a threshold she could never return from. She expected guilt, maybe horror. Instead, she felt only a strange, hollow relief. Dakota crouched before her, studying her face. His eyes, dark and solemn, held no judgment. Slowly, he placed his hand over his chest, then extended it toward her, a gesture she had come to understand as recognition. As acceptance, Elena mirrored the gesture, her palm pressing against her chest. The movement was awkward, but it felt right. For the first time, she was not being claimed as property, but welcomed as equal. The days that followed were harsh but different. They left the battlefield behind, moving deeper into Apache lands. Dakota led the way, always watchful, always silent. Elena followed, her steps unsteady at first but growing stronger. The land itself seemed to change as they traveled. The settlement faded into memory, its fences and cabins shrinking into nothing. Ahead stretched canyons carved by time, rivers hidden beneath stone, and high mesas crowned with endless sky. The air smelled cleaner, the nights colder but alive with stars. Elena no longer looked at the horizon with longing alone. She looked at it with purpose. When they reached Dakota's people, she felt her fear return. She had expected suspicion, maybe even rejection, and at first there was both. The women watched her closely, whispering among themselves. The men eyed her with caution, their hands never far from their weapons. A white woman in their camp was not a thing taken lightly. But Dakota's word carried weight. He spoke few sentences, each sharp as flint, and though Elena did not understand the language, she understood his meaning. She was under his protection. She was not a prisoner. She was not a burden. She was his choice. It did not erase all doubt, but it opened a path. Elena worked alongside the women, fumbling at first but learning quickly. She carried water, ground maize, tended fires. The tasks were different, yet not unfamiliar labor had always been her lot. But here, no hand struck her when she faltered. No voice mocked her when she stumbled. Instead, patient instruction guided her, quiet laughter softened her mistakes. For the first time since her childhood, she felt the warmth of community. At night, sitting by the fire, she listened to the songs. The voices rose into the sky, low and steady, carrying grief and joy alike. Dakota sat among them, his face calmer. Now, though the sorrow of his widowhood never left him entirely, Elena did not pretend to fill the emptiness of his loss, but she understood it. He, in turn, understood hers. The settlers would not forget her, nor would they forget garrisons. Death, she knew this. One day, men with rifles would come again. But she no longer felt like prey waiting for the strike. She had learned to fight. She had learned to endure. And she had someone beside her who had chosen to stand, not because she was his possession, but because she was his equal. As the fire crackled, Elena lifted her gaze to the stars. They no longer looked like distant promises. They looked like a map, a sky she now belonged beneath. Her life had been stolen, beaten, caged. But now, in this place, among these people, with Dakota at her side, she felt something she had never dared believe possible. She felt free.